Hello, welcome to the Learn English Lab. Today we're really going to dig into something complex. It's a deep dive focused on IELTS listening practice, specifically globalization and the economy.
That's right. It's a huge topic, and we've gathered some, pretty insightful material on it. Globalization. It's this whole process, isn't it? Increasing connections between countries.
Yeah, through trade, investment, technology spreading like wildfire, even cultural exchange, it all ties together.
It does. And our focus here is really how all that interconnectedness shapes the global economy.
It feels incredibly relevant. You see it everywhere, what's on the shelves, job market news. Understanding this stuff isn't just academic, it's, pretty vital.
Especially if you need to discuss or write about economic trends, maybe for IELTS or just, to understand the world better.
Right. So our mission today?
Simple, really. We want to pull out the key insights from the information we have, get a handle on the nuances, and give you a solid grasp of how globalization really impacts economies.
Kind of a shortcut to getting informed on this big subject, based just on what we've looked at for this dive.
Exactly. No fluff, just the core ideas and examples.
Okay, let's jump in then. The starting point, the core concept the material gives us, is that globalization equals increasing interconnectedness.
Right. It's more than just countries trading goods. It's money flowing across borders easier than ever, tech connecting everyone almost instantly, cultures mixing.
And the key takeaway is that this isn't just some small shift. The material frames it as something that has fundamentally transformed the global economy.
That word transformed is crucial. It changes the whole landscape for businesses, for workers, for you as a consumer. Everything operates differently now, the scale, the speed.
It sets the stage for everything else we'll talk about. And the information kind of breaks it down, starting with the potential positives, the economic benefits.
Indeed. And one of the biggest ones, mentioned right off the bat, is expanded trade. More access to markets.
How does that work exactly?
Well, globalization has really focused on reducing those old obstacles, things that made trading across borders difficult and expensive, like tariffs, taxes on imports.
Or quotas, limiting how much you can bring in.
Exactly. By lowering those, you make trade easier, cheaper, and so naturally, more of it happens.
And it seems like international organizations and agreements are key players here.
Yeah.
Like the WTO, the World Trade Organization.
Absolutely. The WTO and also regional deals like the CPTPP, that big Pacific Partnership Agreement, they create the rules, the framework.
They sort of smooth the path for goods and services to flow between countries.
That's a good way to put it. They provide predictability, structure, businesses know what to expect, more or less.
Is there a good example of this in action?
Yeah, the material highlights Vietnam's textile sector. It's apparently flourished, grown hugely because it gained access to export markets like the US and Europe.
So they could sell their textiles to millions more customers.
Precisely. And that ability to export became a major driver, a real engine for Vietnam's overall economic growth.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
If you suddenly have a massive new market open up, tariff-free or with lower tariffs, that's a game changer.
It really is. And the underlying economic idea here, highlighted in the info, is comparative advantage.
Okay, comparative advantage. Remind us briefly.
Sure. It's not just about being the absolute best at making something. It's about being able to produce it at a lower opportunity cost than another country.
Opportunity cost.
Yeah.
What you give up to make something else.
Exactly. So even if, say, the US is better at making both computers and shirts than Vietnam, maybe the US is way better at computers, but only slightly better at shirts.
Okay.
Vietnam might be not as good at computers, but maybe their disadvantage in making shirts is much smaller. So the US has the comparative advantage in computers.
And Vietnam has the comparative advantage in shirts, even if they aren't the world's absolute best shirt maker.
Right. Because the US gives up less potential computer production to make shirts than Vietnam does, and Vietnam gives up less potential, something else, to make shirts.
So countries should focus on where their relative advantage is biggest or disadvantage is smallest.
That's the idea. Specialize in what you're relatively best at, where your opportunity cost is lowest, and then trade. The theory is everyone ends up with more stuff overall.
And globalization, by reducing trade barriers, lets this specialization happen on a huge global scale.
Yeah, that's what the material suggests. It boosts overall economic efficiency. For Vietnam, that advantage was clearly in textiles, letting them become a major global competitor.
It's fascinating how removing a simple tariff can reshape what whole countries focus on. So practically, how does that specialization work? Does everyone just switch jobs?
Well, not overnight, but over time, a country's resources like its workers, its investment money, even its land tend to flow towards those industries where it's most competitive globally.
So in Vietnam, more investment and more people started working in textiles and clothing.
Right, they build up expertise, get really efficient, achieve that scale needed to compete. Meanwhile, maybe the countries buying those textiles shift their resources into, say, high tech or finance, where they have an advantage.
Like a global division of labor, different places specializing in different things.
Exactly. Theoretically, it makes the whole global economic pie bigger.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like teamwork on a global scale. So that leads us to the next big benefit mentioned, foreign direct investment, FDI.
Ah, yes, FDI. Another really key element of globalization's economic upside, according to the info.
And this isn't just buying some shares, right? It's more substantial.
Much more. FDI is when a multinational corporation, an MNC, makes a serious, tangible investment in another country. Like building a factory, setting up a big office, buying a controlling stake in a local company. It's a long-term commitment.
And the big positives highlighted are job creation and technology transfer.
Those are the main ones cited. When a big company builds a factory abroad, they need local people to work there. That's direct job creation.
Are there examples?
Several strong ones in the material. Apple's manufacturing operations in China mentioned as employing millions. That's FDI creating jobs on a massive scale.
Wow, millions.
Or India's IT sector boom. A lot of that growth was fueled by Western companies outsourcing work there, which is a form of investment-seeking skilled labor.
Right, outsource is linked too.
And then there's infrastructure. The material mentions industrial parks built in Ethiopia with Chinese investment. That's not just jobs inside the park, but the roads, the power. It helps the whole area.
Those are powerful examples of job creation. But, is FDI always a purely good thing? Does the information touch on any, downsides or complexities later on?
It does hint at it, yes. While this section focuses on benefits, later points bring up nuances. For instance, what kind of jobs are created? Are they high-skill or mostly low-skill assembly?
Good question.
And technology transfer, is it the latest tech or older processes? Plus, there's the risk of dependency or investment just focused on resource extraction without wider benefits. We'll get into that.
Okay, so it's complex. But sticking with the upsides for now, FDI brings in capital, creates jobs. What's next? Consumer benefits and economies of scale.
This is where globalization probably feels most real for people day to day. The information explains that because companies from all over the world are competing, it pushes prices down.
More competition means better deals for us.
Right, lower prices, often better quality as companies try to stand out, and just way more choice. Think about electronics, clothes, food.
Yeah, you can buy stuff from everywhere now. Electronics designed here, made there, parts from somewhere else. Often cheaper than they used to be. Coffee from Brazil, right here.
Exactly. And the key concept behind the affordability is economies of scale.
Ah, right. The bigger you get, the cheaper it is to make each individual item.
Pretty much. If a company can sell to the whole world, not just one country, its production volume can be enormous.
So they buy raw materials cheaper in bulk, run factories more efficiently, spread fixed costs like R&D over millions of units.
Yes. And those cost savings can then theoretically be passed on to you, the consumer, as lower prices.
Is there an example for this?
The classic one mentioned is a giant retailer like Walmart. Their whole model relies on a global supply chain, sourcing things from the cheapest places worldwide to sell in huge volumes.
That massive scale in buying and logistics allows them to keep prices low.
That's a huge part of their strategy, enabled by globalization. It makes a lot of goods more affordable for average shoppers.
It really does change the shopping landscape. Thinking about it, how has your own experience changed over the years because of this?
Oh, dramatically. I remember when certain things were just unavailable or considered real luxuries because they were imported and expensive. Now the variety is just astounding. You walk into a store or go online and the world's products are there.
True. But you mentioned earlier this competition can be tough on local businesses, right?
Absolutely. That's one of the major downsides we'll discuss. This intense global competition has casualties too.
A definite trade-off. Okay, the last benefit listed in this section. Job creation again, but also labor mobility.
Right. So, beyond FDI creating jobs, the simple act of exporting creates jobs in those export-focused industries. The material points again to Bangladesh's garment sector.
Employing millions, primarily making clothes for export.
Exactly. If your country becomes a global hub for something, it can mean a lot of jobs. But globalization also makes it easier for people to move for work.
Skilled workers moving to countries where their expertise is needed.
Yes, the examples provided are things like Indian engineers working in Silicon Valley or nurses from the Philippines helping fill healthcare shortages in places like the UK.
People moving to where the jobs match their skills.
And there's a huge economic consequence of that movement beyond just the jobs themselves, remittances.
The money sent back home by workers abroad.
Crucial for many economies.
Yeah.
The info highlights the Philippines receiving over $30 billion a year from its citizens working overseas.
30 billion, that's massive. What does that money do?
It's a vital lifeline. Families use it for everyday needs, education, healthcare, maybe starting a small business. It pumps foreign currency into the economy and helps reduce poverty significantly.
That's a really significant impact. Let's explore this idea of a global labor market a bit. What are the wider implications of people moving like this for both the countries they leave and the countries they go to?
Well, for the sending country, like the Philippines or India, there's often talk of brain drain, losing talented people. But as those remittance numbers show, the money coming back can be a huge economic plus, maybe even outweighing the loss of that person's direct labor in the country.
So it's a complex calculation for the home country.
It is. And for the receiving country, say the US or UK, it fills vital skill gaps. They need those engineers, those nurses. But it can also bring social challenges, immigration debates, potential wage impacts for local workers, integration issues.
So benefits and challenges on both sides. The information focuses mostly on the economic upside here, though.
Primarily, yes. Job creation in export sectors and the economic boost from remittances driven by labor mobility.
Okay, so we've laid out a pretty positive case based on the material. More trade, investment boosting growth, benefits for consumers, jobs from exports, and people moving for work and sending money home. But, as you said, it's not the whole story. Time to look at the challenges.
Definitely. The information is quite clear that globalization has significant downsides too. And the first big one tackled is widening economic inequality.
How does globalization make inequality worse?
The core idea presented is that the benefits aren't spread evenly. Wealthier nations and big multinational corporations often gain the most. And within countries, certain groups can be left behind.
Like low-skilled workers in developed countries.
Yes, that's a key point. They can face job losses when companies move production to countries with lower wages, outsourcing.
The example always used is the U.S. Rust Belt, right? Manufacturing jobs disappearing as factories move to, say, Mexico or China.
That's a textbook example cited in the material. It shows that direct impact, lower costs elsewhere, leading to job losses at home. But the inequality isn't just between rich and poor countries.
It happens within countries too.
Absolutely. The material uses India as an example, highlighting a growing divide between urban and rural areas. Cities connected to the global IT and service economy boom, while rural areas relying on traditional agriculture might lag behind.
So the gap widens inside the country itself.
Exactly. Urban incomes rise faster, opportunities concentrate in cities, leaving rural populations further behind.
This inequality point feels like a really crucial counterweight to the efficiency arguments. How does that drive for global efficiency sometimes clash so directly with spreading the wealth more fairly?
Well, think about what efficiency means in this context. It means finding the lowest cost production, the highest return on investment. That naturally pulls jobs and capital towards places with lower wages or concentrates high-value work in already advanced hubs.
Which is great for company profits and often leads to cheaper goods globally.
Right, those are real benefits. But the system doesn't automatically redirect those gains to the person who lost their factory job or the farmer in the lagging rural area. The rewards flow to certain skills, certain locations, owners of capital, unless governments actively step in with policies to redistribute or support those left behind. Efficiency and equity can definitely pull in opposite directions.
That's a critical distinction.
Oh.
Next challenge, the erosion of local economies.
This one hits close to home for many communities. The information explains how small local businesses often really struggle to compete against giant MNCs.
Because the big guys have economies of scale, global brands.
Exactly. They can often sell things cheaper than a local shop can even buy them for, and they have huge marketing power.
The examples given are quite stark local shops in Africa, finding it hard when a huge chain like Carrefour arrives.
It's a tough battle. And it's not just retail. Traditional industries face pressure too. Think about local artisans, maybe making handicrafts in India.
They struggle against cheap, mass-produced alternatives flooding the market.
Precisely. It becomes harder to make a living from traditional skills when standardized, lower-cost global products are readily available.
It makes you wonder, is there any way for these local economies to survive? Or even find a way to thrive alongside these global giants? And what do we actually lose when they disappear?
The information doesn't really offer easy solutions. Survival often means finding a niche, unique products, high-quality cultural value, personalized service, community connection, things the big chains can't easily replicate.
The loss. It's more than just jobs, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. It's the character of a place, traditional skills vanishing, community ties weakening. Local businesses often keep money circulating locally. When profits go to a global HQ, that local economic energy dissipates.
The reminder that economics, society, and culture are all intertwined. Okay, another big challenge. Economic vulnerability. Global crises spreading faster.
Yes, this is a direct result of being so interconnected. When economies rely heavily on each other for trade and finance, a shock in one place can ripple outwards much more quickly and severely.
The 2008 financial crisis is the classic example, starting in the U.S. housing market.
Exactly. It began with subprime mortgages in the U.S., but because financial institutions globally were all linked, trading complex products, the crisis went global almost overnight. Banks failed everywhere, credit dried up, recession hit worldwide.
Far beyond where the problem started.
And a more recent example we all felt, the COVID-19 pandemic.
Primarily a health crisis, but the economic fallout was massive because of globalization.
Right. Lockdowns in one country shut down factories supplying parts for industries thousands of miles away. The material mentions the auto industry, for example, car production lines halted because they couldn't get specific components from overseas suppliers affected by the pandemic.
It really showed how tangled those global supply chains are.
And the information stresses that developing nations can be particularly vulnerable, especially those relying on exporting just one or two things, like coffee or minerals.
If global demand for their main export crashes due to a recession elsewhere,
their whole economy can be devastated. This idea is sometimes called global contagion. Does being connected mean you share the risk?
it seems like it largely does.
To a great extent, yes. It's like a complex machine, efficient when running smoothly, but a failure in one part can bring the whole thing down. While it offers some resilience through diverse markets, it also creates this fragility, this exposure to distant shocks.
A major downside of being so linked. The final challenge discussed here is quite serious. Labor exploitation and ethical concerns.
Yes, this connects back to that relentless drive for lower costs in global supply chains. The information highlights that this can, unfortunately, lead to workers being exploited, especially in developing countries,
where labor laws might be weaker or not enforced properly.
Exactly. We're talking about problems like very low wages, unsafe working conditions, excessive hours, often in factories making goods for consumers in richer countries.
The material specifically mentions Bangladesh's garment industry again.
It does. Acknowledging it creates jobs, but also pointing to the serious ethical questions and past tragedies concerning factory safety and worker rights in that sector.
Suggesting that the focus on profit for MNCs can sometimes mean labor rights get overlooked somewhere down the supply chain.
That's the implication. The material refers to controversies involving certain brands, suggesting this tension between cost-cutting and ethical treatment is a real and persistent problem.
Which brings up huge ethical questions for companies, consumers, everyone. How do we balance cheap goods with fair treatment?
It fuels the debate around things like ethical consumerism, people trying to choose products based on how they were made, and demands for companies to be much more transparent and accountable for conditions in their supply chains. It's presented as a core ethical dilemma of globalization.
So we've covered the benefits, the challenges. Now the information looks at how this all plays out differently depending on the type of economy we're talking about. Developed, developing, least developed.
Right, because globalization doesn't hit everywhere the same way. For developed economies, think US, Germany, Japan, the material points out they get big benefits from easy access to imports, cheaper consumer goods, components for their own industries.
And they have huge global markets for their own strengths, high-tech stuff, services, intellectual property.
Exactly. They leverage their edge in innovation and skills, but importantly, the info also stresses the challenges they face. Primarily losing manufacturing jobs.
Right, we touched on this with inequality and outsourcing.
Yes, it circles back. Automation and moving production overseas hit traditional industrial areas hard. The material uses the UK's industrial regions as an example, job losses leading to big efforts in retraining workers for different sectors like services or tech.
So even wealthy countries are constantly adapting to these shifts. How do they manage that transition away from manufacturing effectively?
The material doesn't give a magic formula, but mentioning retraining suggests a big focus on education, skills development, fostering innovation, trying to equip the workforce for the jobs where the country does have a competitive edge globally. It's about navigating a major economic restructuring.
Okay, then developing economies like China and India, the transformation there has been massive, according to the info.
Absolutely dramatic. China's story is presented as export-led growth on an unprecedented scale. Becoming the world's factory lifted it to become a global economic superpower incredibly quickly.
And India's path was more through the service sector.
Yes, fueled by global outsourcing, becoming a huge hub for IT services, call centers, business process operations for companies worldwide.
Huge success stories in terms of growth and poverty reduction. But the material flags challenges there too.
Definitely. It's not portrayed as entirely positive. Significant environmental costs are mentioned, like severe air pollution in cities like Beijing from all that industry. And labor exploitation issues, as we discussed, remain a concern in some sectors.
What are the potential long-term issues with that kind of super fast, sometimes unbalanced growth?
The information suggests that relying so heavily on one-engine exports for China, services for India creates vulnerabilities if global demand shifts. Environmental damage has long-term health and economic costs. Plus, rapid urbanization and change creates social stresses. Balancing growth with sustainability and equity becomes the next big challenge.
And finally, the least developed economies, LDCs. Places like Zambia or Haiti mentioned. They face a unique set of issues.
Very much so. While globalization could bring benefits like FDI or aid, the risks highlighted are significant. One is the debt trap danger.
Taking on big loans for projects, maybe from foreign powers, and then struggling to repay.
Exactly. Especially if the projects don't deliver the expected economic boost, or the loan terms are tough. It can cripple a country financially. Sri Lanka's recent issues are sometimes cited in this context.
So investment comes in, but it might create more problems down the line.
It's a risk. Another major one mentioned is resource exploitation. LDCs often have valuable natural resources. Globalization increases demand, attracting foreign companies to extract them.
But the risk is the wealth flows out, leaving little benefit locally.
That's the concern. Resources get extracted, maybe with environmental damage, but the profits go overseas, and the country doesn't see broad-based development from its own natural wealth.
It really highlights how vulnerable LDCs can be. How can globalization be shaped to actually help these countries more reliably?
By pointing out these risks, debt traps, unfair resource deals, the information implicitly suggests the need for fairer international practices. More transparency, support for LDCs to negotiate better deals, investment focused on genuine development, not just extraction. It suggests the current system can be disadvantageous without conscious efforts to make it fairer.
Okay, a very varied picture across different economies. Now let's bring in technology more directly, the digital thread.
Technology is presented as a core driver of modern globalization. It's what enables the speed and efficiency we see today. Instant communication, complex supply chains managed in real time.
Things like e-commerce platforms, Amazon, Alibaba, connecting buyers and sellers globally.
Exactly. And digital payment systems like PayPal making international transactions so much simpler and faster than old banking methods.
They break down geographical barriers.
Completely. The material gives a neat example. Small businesses in Kenya using mobile money apps like M-Pesa to trade internationally. Technology empowering even small players.
It feels like digital tech hasn't just increased the scale, but massively increased the pace of globalization compared to, say, 50 years ago.
Oh, exponentially faster. Think about coordinating production across continents before the internet faxes slow mail. Now, design changes are instant, supply chains monitored live, money moves in seconds. It's compressed time and space for economic activity.
But there's always a but with globalization, isn't there? The digital divide.
Yes, a critical counterpoint raised in the material. Unequal access to technology, internet, devices, skills creates this divide.
Meaning some countries or regions just can't plug into these tech-driven benefits.
Precisely. It limits their ability to participate fully. India is used as an example again. Cities might be fully digital, while rural areas lack basic internet access.
And that stops people in those rural areas from accessing global e-commerce, online education, digital job markets.
Exactly. It hinders their economic participation and reinforces existing inequalities.
This digital divide seems like it could seriously lock in disadvantages. What are the economic consequences if you're stuck on the wrong side?
It means being shut out of major growth sectors. New jobs, new business models are heavily digital. Without access, individuals and regions miss out on these opportunities, potentially widening the gap between the connected and the unconnected world. It's another layer of inequality.
So tech is both the engine and potentially a new barrier. Let's shift to the environment now, the ecological footprint.
A major area of concern highlighted. More global trade, more global consumption means more demand for resources, more energy use, more transportation, all impacting the environment.
The examples are pretty clear. Global shipping burning massive amounts of fuel, contributing to emissions.
Huge contributor. And global demand driving land use changes. Deforestation, like in Brazil, linked to rising global demand for things like soy and beef. Clearing forests for farms and ranches.
It highlights a fundamental conflict, doesn't it? The drive for economic growth through more trade and consumption versus environmental limits.
There's a core tension there. An economic model based on ever-increasing production and consumption, using finite resources and generating pollution, inherently clashes with sustainability. Cheaper goods and bigger markets have an environmental cost, resource depletion, climate change, habitat loss. Finding a way to decouple economic well-being from environmental damage is maybe the central challenge.
But interestingly, the information also suggests globalization can help spread positive environmental change. Green technology.
That's the other side of the coin. Because ideas and tech flow globally, it can speed up the development and adoption of things like solar panels, wind power, electric vehicles.
International collaboration. Companies selling green tech worldwide.
Exactly. Companies like Tesla expanding globally help spread EV technology faster. Global markets can drive down the cost of green tech through scale and competition.
So the same global forces can work both ways.
Potentially. But there's a caveat mentioned. Adopting these green technologies is uneven. Developing countries might lag behind because of the high upfront costs, even if they're very vulnerable to climate change impacts.
It leaves you wondering if the green tech spread can happen fast enough and fairly enough to offset the environmental damage from other aspects of globalization.
That is indeed the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it? The information presents both sides, suggesting the outcome isn't fixed. It depends on choices we make.
Okay, moving towards the end, let's look at social and cultural impacts that have economic dimensions. It's not all just numbers.
Right. One concern raised is cultural homogenization. The fear that dominant global brands, media, and trends might swamp local cultures.
Which can then hit local economies tied to traditional crafts or practices, like the example of indigenous crafts in Mexico struggling against mass-produced stuff.
Exactly. If the unique, culturally specific product can't compete economically with the cheap global alternative, the tradition itself and the livelihoods based on it are threatened.
But again, there's a counter-narrative. Globalization can also export culture.
Yes. The prime example given is K-pop. South Korea's music and culture becoming a global phenomenon, bringing in huge economic benefits, not just music sales, but tourism, merchandise, brand image.
So it's not just Western culture flowing out.
Yep.
Other cultures can find massive global audiences too.
Definitely. It shows globalization can be a platform for diverse cultural expression to find a global market, creating new economic value.
So for culture and related economies, it's a real double-edged sword. Some challenged, others boosted. How does that balance out?
The material suggests it's really dynamic and varied. Some traditional economies struggle, others adapt or find niches. And new global cultural industries, like K-pop, emerge. It's a complex picture of competition and adaptation.
Another social aspect with economic links: social mobility and education.
The idea here is that globalization can open up pathways for people to improve their situation through education and work opportunities that wouldn't exist otherwise.
How does that work?
Things like international scholarships letting students study abroad. And crucially, online learning platforms giving people, especially in developing countries, access to world-class knowledge and skills training.
So access to global education, online or overseas, can equip people with skills valued in the global job market, helping bridge some of those inequality gaps we talked about.
That's the potential highlighted, empowering individuals with knowledge and skills to participate more effectively, find better jobs, and improve their social standing, regardless of where they live.
And all this interconnectedness naturally leads to political and policy questions, governing the flow.
A huge challenge for governments, as the information points out. How do you stay open to the benefits of trade and investment while also protecting your own industries and workers from the negative impacts.
The classic balancing act between free trade and protectionism.
Exactly. The material mentions protectionist measures like tariffs, the U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods, for example, aimed at protecting domestic industries, but risking trade disputes.
Where countries hit back with their own tariffs, potentially harming everyone involved.
Right. On the flip side, very open policies attract investment, but might lead to concerns about losing economic sovereignty control over your own rules and economy.
The Brexit debate is mentioned as an example of these tensions, worrying about rules being set by international bodies or global market forces.
Yes, that illustrates the tension between integration and maintaining national control. It's a constant political debate.
What are the core arguments for and against protectionism in today's world, based on what we've covered?
Arguments for protectionism usually focus on saving domestic jobs, shielding industries from what's seen as unfair competition, low wages, subsidies elsewhere, national security for key sectors. Arguments against it emphasize lower prices and more choice for consumers, greater overall efficiency through specialization, benefits for export industries, and avoiding damaging trade wars.
And overseeing all this are global institutions like the WTO and IMF.
They play a key role in setting the rules and trying to manage the system, yes. The WTO for trade, the IMF for financial stability and assistance.
But they face criticism too.
Yes, the material notes the critique, especially from developing nations, that their policies sometimes seem to favor developed countries' interests. The example given is IMF loan conditions requiring austerity measures, like spending cuts that can harm vulnerable populations and countries needing help.
Raising questions about fairness in the global system they manage. How effective are these bodies, really? And are there alternatives?
The information presents the criticism, implying their effectiveness and fairness are debatable, particularly from a developing country perspective. It doesn't spell out alternatives, but the critique suggests a need for reforms or different approaches that give more weight to equity and the specific needs of less powerful nations.
We've certainly covered a lot of ground. From the basics of interconnectedness through the big economic pluses like trade and investment to the serious downsides like inequality, vulnerability, exploitation.
And how it all looks different depending on whether you're in a rich country, a developing one, or one of the least developed, plus the roles of tech, the environment, culture,
and the constant political balancing act. It really underscores the importance of understanding this stuff, especially for contexts like IELTS where you might need to discuss it. The vocabulary is key, isn't it?
Absolutely. Terms like trade liberalization, FDI, remittances, socioeconomic disparity, sustainable development, protectionism, knowing what they mean is crucial.
And using real-world examples makes it all stick. The material highlighted several good ones.
Yeah, like China's Belt and Road showing investment but also debt risks.
The 2008 crisis showing interdependence and how things spread.
Bangladesh's garment sector jobs versus exploitation, a real-world dilemma.
And Brexit globalization versus sovereignty. These examples make the abstract concepts concrete, right?
Exactly. They show you where and how these forces operate. Comparative advantage becomes Vietnam's textiles. Vulnerability becomes the 2008 crash. Labor issues become Bangladesh. They anchor the ideas in reality, making them easier to understand, analyze, and talk about. It shows globalization isn't just theory, it's real-world impact.
It really does. So wrapping up this deep dive, we saw globalization as this web of connections, bringing opportunities like trade, growth, consumer choice, but also serious challenges. Inequality, instability, ethical issues, environmental costs. Impacts vary hugely, and it forces constant adaptation and difficult policy choices.
It's a complex, powerful force full of contradictions, creating wealth and connection, but also raising profound questions about fairness and sustainability.
Which leaves us with a final thought to ponder. Given all these multifaceted impacts, the amazing opportunities and the undeniable difficulties, how might we, collectively, think about shaping a version of globalization that keeps the dynamism but becomes genuinely more equitable and sustainable for everyone, everywhere?
That's perhaps the defining challenge of our time, a big question to carry forward.
Indeed. If you found this deep dive valuable for your learning journey, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this YouTube channel.